Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 163 of the Forge of Freedom. I hope everybody had a Merry Christmas. Of course, I'm recording this. It's December 30th, actually December 29th. Sorry, it will be released on December 30th, and many of you may be listening to this after the new year, so I hope everybody has a wonderful new year. I know lots of people will be making New Year's resolutions that they hope to stick to, and I'm sure I'll be doing the same as well. But I wanted to return to a topic that I care a lot about, partly because I deal with it in my practice as an attorney practically every day. I've represented hundreds, if not thousands, of people charged with drug crimes by this point in my career, and I see the devastation that the war on drugs causes. And of course, there's a component of personal responsibility to this. The people who are using the drugs are choosing to use the drugs, and despite their illegality and despite the harm that it may cause them. But I think that from a broader perspective, looking past the drug user themselves, I think that the war on drugs, as it's implemented by the government, is even more horrific than the use of drugs by the individuals themselves. And I talked about this early on in the Forge of Freedom. It was episode 3, as a matter of fact. I feel so strongly about this topic. I think that the war on drugs is immoral, but not only immoral, but also ineffective and counterproductive. Not just a huge waste of money, not just a huge waste of other resources and productive human activity, but actually counterproductive, in addition to the immorality of the endeavor. And just from a basic level, I've talked about this on a number of occasions on the podcast. The idea of rights and liberties stems from the idea of self-ownership, and very few people would argue against this point. Of course, there is an argument to be made, but nevertheless, I think most people would agree as an assumption that we own our own bodies. There is nobody, no other person who has a greater right to our body than ourselves. Of course, that's with respect to other humans. If you believe in a deity or a god, as many people do, you may believe that that deity or God has a greater entitlement or greater right to your body than you do, but no other human does. And very few people would argue with that point. But they may say that, but society as a whole has some interest in controlling what you do with your own body, i.e., preventing you from consuming drugs because it's good for the whole. But what we've seen through the war on drugs is that the results are catastrophic. And what this often, I think, stems from is good intentions. People who want to create laws against the consumption of certain types of products, whether it's heroin or sugary drinks. They have good intentions. They want people to be healthier. They want people to have more productive lives. But the implementation of these good intentions generally leads to terrible results. And so setting aside the most important component, the moral component, I think that these are still ineffective and, more strongly stated, counterproductive and catastrophic. And I think that this, even though it stems from these prohibitions stem from good intentions of wanting a more pure society. I think that often it stems from a lack of knowledge about human behavior, and then also a severe lack of knowledge about economics. And I think that, and I'll say this, I'll just say it up front. There's lots of concern about immigration, largely because of the violence that people see as a result of illegal immigration, and largely as a result of the drugs that are seen to come across the border, the illegal drugs that are seen coming across the border coincident with this illegal immigration. But I think that what people don't realize is that that is a byproduct. Sometimes the illegal immigration itself is a byproduct of the war on drugs. And because people are fleeing from gang violence, from sort of drug warlord environments in Mexico and in South America, they're fleeing that environment for a better life. That's not the only reason, but that's, I think, the reason for lots of folks. I've had clients who have said that, clients who are both here legally and illegally, who have said that. I've had, but I think that the other thing is that there are people coming across illegally to import these illegal drugs, and it's as a result of the black market that's created by prohibition. If an item is prohibited, if it's illegal, and there's still a demand for it, where does that market to satisfy that demand have to go? It has to go underground. It has to go to the so-called black market. It's not a formal market, or it's not a market that is a free market, a market that exists without the potential consequence of incarceration or the use of force by government. So it's this underground market, it's this secretive market, and it's a market that's highly violent and incredibly dangerous. And it's a market that's impossible to regulate because there's no way for me to know, if I'm a consumer of the product from the black market, whether that product is safe or not, because I don't know where it's coming from. If I'm the end user in Indiana using a product from Mexico or China or wherever it's coming from, I don't know the source. I don't know. It's not like beer. I can't say it's from a batch of beer that was made by Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, Missouri, and go back to the source and find out, oh, this is where the mistake was made. This is where the contaminated product came from. There is no mechanism to prevent bad products or bad actors because it's completely underground. And there's this sort of fairy tale mentality that somehow the police and prosecutors and the courts and the prisons can get rid of this. And it's just simply not possible without a complete police state and a prison society. And even then, it's not possible. But that's the road that we're heading down. It's the constant clamor for more resources, for more police, for more prosecutors, for more jail and prison time and resources is all advocated for because they say, the proponents of the drug war, we just don't have enough resources. If you just give us more money, if you just give us more power, if you just give us more weaponry, we can get rid of this. We can solve this epidemic of drug overdoses and drug violence. But what they don't realize is that they're actually perpetuating the problem and making the problem worse by making the black market more robust, more violent, more sophisticated to counter their tactics. And they're always a step behind. They're always reacting to the black market, to the drug gangs. And I think that I've not heard anybody give a good counter argument to this, that if we legalized drugs, not just decriminalized, but legalized drugs, the drug gangs would go out of business, at least with respect to the drug trade, because there would be products for sale on the free and open market that were safe, that were not contaminated, and that would still be bad for you. And believe me, I'm not advocating for drug use, illegal or otherwise, unless it's necessary. I think that people should try to live a life that's, in a way, that's a good steward of your body and your mind. So I'm absolutely not advocating for drug use that impairs your physical or mental capacity. But what I'm saying is, people are going to use these products anyway. And because they're going to use them anyway, and because it's the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, not to control what they do or don't consume, because they have the right to control their own body as long as they are not directly committing violence against someone else. Again, that goes back to the non-aggression principle and the right of self-ownership. They should be free to consume the products they want to consume. And they can do so safely, or relatively safely, without the fear of overdose or a contaminated product, if it's on a free and open market where there is the ability to know who's producing it, to know how they're producing it, to sue them if they make it in a way that's negligent or harmful. The black market would cease to exist, because most people who use drugs, illegal drugs, don't want to die. That's why they often use them out in the public, because if they overdose, or they're afraid they're going to overdose, they want somebody to find them so they don't die. That's why they use them in public restrooms, in parking lots, on sidewalks, etc. So very few drug users have a death wish. The other thing is that the cost of enforcing the war on drugs is astronomical. And I want to bring up a point here that was made by, I'll get to an article actually that my father, Mike Ooley, sent to me. But I want to bring up this quote, or actually it's a post on X by Clark Neely, who's a constitutional attorney. He was actually instrumental in District of Columbia versus Heller. He litigated that case along with Alan Gura. But he's also very passionate about and against the coercive mechanisms present in the criminal justice system, particularly mass plea bargaining. But he's also an advocate against drug prohibition. And he says, and I'll put this up here on the screen actually. He says, drug prohibition and mass plea bargaining are two bedrock policies of our criminal justice system. Both come with massive gross costs. To decide whether they are nevertheless net beneficial, you'd have to have at least some idea what those costs are and their magnitude. And here he's getting at some of the points I was making earlier about this disconnect between, not only setting aside the moral issue, this disconnect between the enforcement of the war on drugs and economics and basic economic principles. And he goes on, he says, I've never met, and I'm right there with him on this, I've never met a proponent of the drug war or plea-driven mass adjudication who could give anything like a coherent account of their costs. Instead, It's like talking to a child who thinks dirty dishes wash themselves and Christmas presents just magically appear under the tree. And this is an important point that most people don't realize. Most law enforcement, most prosecutors, most judges, most prison staff, sheriffs, and so on have no idea what it cost for the service, the war on drugs, that they're providing. And this is the article to illustrate this point a little bit. I want to bring up this article that Mike shared with me. And this is an article from a local news station here I'm in southern Indiana near Louisville, Kentucky. It's WDRB.com, and this is from December 13th, 2024. It says, undercover operation in southern Indiana leads to more than a dozen arrests. And if you go down through the article, this was in Harrison County. More than a dozen people have been arrested. It was 19 arrest warrants, an operation called Operation Dry Ice, and it took place over a 6-month investigation. And I want you to think about that for a minute. Somewhere between a dozen and 20 people, 19 warrants, 6-month investigation, and these people are arrested in Harrison County on various charges, but primarily related to dealing in methamphetamine or controlled substances. And they say, we're doing our best to get drug dealers out of the community as quickly and safely as possible. But what did this operation, this is just a small operation, relatively small operation in southern Indiana, a relatively rural area of southern Indiana, to arrest a dozen people for dealing substances. And if you ask anybody who's involved in this operation, anybody who is overseeing this operation, I would guarantee that none of them have even the slightest idea about what it took to investigate this and to complete and execute the warrants for these. And that doesn't include, obviously, the ongoing cost after the investigation, the cost to incarcerate, the cost to prosecute, the cost to further incarcerate if there's a conviction. And for what? They're playing this perpetual game of whack-a-mole, and they can't even keep drugs out of prisons. Okay, and this is not like, oh, drugs make it into prisons or jails every once in a while. This is a huge problem. Drugs are in nearly every jail and prison around the country. The black market persists where there's a profit motive, and that persists even beyond or through jail and prison walls. So they're in this never-ending, perpetual cycle of violence and incarceration and spitting these people back out into society with significant stigma, no resources, no nothing, often broken families if they weren't broken already. So what they're saying is, and this, I don't know where I got this. I've heard, I didn't come up with it, but I think it says it rather succinctly. They're saying, what the government is doing is they're saying, you might ruin your life by using drugs. So we're going to guarantee to ruin your life. We'll just expedite the process. we will guarantee we're going to ruin your life by arresting you, prosecuting you, and sending you to prison. So what otherwise might have ruined your life anyway on your own voluntary accord, we're going to guarantee it. And we're going to spend millions, if not billions, of dollars nationwide to do it. But, by the way, we actually have no idea what it cost. But give us more money anyway, because there's obviously more of them, more lives we need to ruin. Okay? That's a pretty harsh way to put it, but that's the reality. And I pulled up, I just did a search on WDRB's website. And of course, you could search on Google News or just about any other news site and come up with similar results, I'm sure. But if you just search for drug bust, you'll see here, I searched for drug bust and it came up with 357 results on WDRB's website. You'll see the article that I shared. You'll see a number of other arrests related to gang members, Louisville gang members sentenced to nearly 30 years. And of course, none of this does anything to change the overdose rates or the rate of drug use or the availability. These people who are arrested and prosecuted and incarcerated further are simply replaced because there are always people in line to replace them. But if you scroll, there's numbers and numbers of, here's one at the bottom here from September, Mexican drug cartel tied to Bullitt County drug bust that put nearly 40 people behind bars. Well, I bet if you ask anybody in Bullitt County whether or not the drug problem has been solved down there, they would say, I haven't noticed any difference. Okay? And I'd say the same thing in Harrison County. As a result of this Operation Dry Ice, no perceptible difference. And that's true. Here's page 2. 25 people arrested in southern Indiana. Police bust major drug ring with ties to Louisville. Okay. You ask the same question anywhere if there's any perceptible difference, and most people would tell you the problem actually has gotten worse despite these operations, despite these huge drug busts, despite mass incarceration. So it comes with a huge, huge cost. Going back to Clark Neely's point, I've never met a proponent of the drug war or plea-driven mass adjudication who could give anything like a coherent account of their costs. So, again, setting aside the moral argument, setting aside, I think, the clear immorality of the endeavor, the war on drugs comes with huge, massive costs, not only in terms of monetary costs, but in terms of what are called opportunity costs. This is money, this is human time and resources that could have been spent elsewhere toward productive means. But also, there are other costs. Costs in terms of privacy, the Fourth Amendment, and many of the state equivalents to the protection against unreasonable search and seizure have been essentially gutted in the name of the war on drugs and safer communities. I can't tell you how many times I have cases where it's just a routine traffic stop and the officer doesn't give a lick, doesn't care a bit about the traffic violation, and immediately goes to, do you have any drugs in the car? Because they're incentivized through grants and operations and organizational incentives to pursue the war on drugs ever more aggressively. So people, innocent people, day to day, are seen or viewed as suspects when they've done nothing wrong. Oftentimes, not even committed a traffic violation, but are stopped under the pretext of a traffic violation so that they can be searched for drugs. So, and that's in the vehicle. That this happens in homes as well. And here's another point. Law enforcement often opposes legalizing marijuana because the smell of marijuana is what gives the officer the ticket to search the vehicle for other stuff. Oftentimes they'll say, oh, I smelled the odor of marijuana, and then that gives them probable cause to search the vehicle for other items. And so it's not that they care about the marijuana so much, because almost nobody in their right mind does care about the marijuana, at least from a law enforcement perspective, except that it provides them the pretense to get in to the vehicle to search for other stuff. So they use it as a tool to search vehicles. All right. So I've got one other. So that was the article from DRB, and I've talked about the war on drugs a fair amount on this podcast, episode 3, episode 58, and I'll link to these in the show notes. In episode 97, I talked about it quite a bit in that episode with Jacob Hornberger when we discussed his book, My Passion for Liberty. But there's this other article, and it's an article by Lawrence Vance, and it's posted at LouRockwell.com, and it's called The Conservative Drug War Creed. And what he points out here, and I don't agree with all of this, but I think he makes a good point. He lists 50 things that basically illustrate this cognitive dissonance that's present, especially among conservative circles, especially when it comes to the war on drugs. And I'm just going to read this because it's relatively short. But he says, if there is one thing that most conservatives have in common, it is their support for the federal government's war on drugs. Although conservatives claim to believe in certain principles that libertarians would likewise hold to, their support of the drug war shows that they don't really believe in them at all. Here is the conservative drug war creed. I believe in the Constitution, but I also believe in the unconstitutional federal war on drugs. I believe in a smaller federal government, but still support a federal drug enforcement administration. I believe in federalism, but not when it comes to the federal war on drugs. I believe in free markets, but not when it comes to a free market in drugs. I believe in individual liberty, but want to see you locked in a cage if you possess too much of a plant the government doesn't approve of. I believe in the personal freedom of individuals to get stoned out of their mind on alcohol, but not on drugs. I believe in states' rights, but not in the right of states to make their own drug laws without having them superseded by federal laws. I believe in property rights, but not the right to grow marijuana on your own property. I believe in free enterprise, but not if it involves drugs. I believe in personal responsibility, but still support mandatory drug treatment programs. I believe in the right of people to smoke tobacco on their own property, but not marijuana. I believe in financial privacy, but not if someone makes money from selling drugs. I believe in personal privacy, but not if someone wants to use drugs in private. I believe a man's home is his castle, but still support no-knock drug raids in the middle of the night if someone is suspected of having drugs in his house. I believe in entrepreneurship, but not if it involves drugs. I believe in low taxes, but want states with legal marijuana to heavily tax it so as to discourage its use. I believe in restricting the number of federal bureaucrats, but not at the DEA. I believe in fiscal conservatism, but have no problem with the costs of the war on drugs far exceeding any of its supposed benefits. I believe in free trade, but not trade in drugs. I believe in nuclear families, but don't mind if one or both parents go to prison for using drugs. I believe in tradition, but ignore the American tradition of having no drug laws until the 20th century. I believe that alcohol should be legal, but not drugs, even though alcohol causes much more harm and kills far more people. I believe tobacco should be legal, but not drugs, even though tobacco causes much more harm and kills far more people. I believe in state sovereignty, but still think the federal government should enforce its marijuana laws in states that have legalized marijuana for medical or recreational use. I believe private property, but if someone is growing marijuana, then it should be destroyed by the DEA's Domestic Cannabis Eradication and Suppression Program. I believe in a smaller federal budget, but not for the DEA. I believe in democracy, but still support having an unelected drug czar. I believe in manufacturing, but not in the manufacture of drugs. I believe in imports, but not the importation of drugs. I believe in fewer federal regulations, but still want the federal government to heavily regulate drugs. I believe in small businesses, but not if someone wants to operate a small marijuana dispensary. I believe in limited government, but still think the federal government should have an Office of National Drug Control Policy. I believe in less legislation, but still fully support the Controlled Substances Act. I believe that Americans are basically law-abiding, but want to turn them into criminals if they smoke a joint. I believe in less government licensing, but still want marijuana growers and dispensaries to be licensed. I believe in the rights of business, but not in the right of businesses to permit drug use on their premises. I believe there are too many federal agencies, but still wouldn't want to see the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration abolished. I believe in a less intrusive government, but still want the government to be concerned with the consumption habits of Americans. I believe the government should not outlaw binge drinking and chain smoking, but should criminalize the possession of any amount of marijuana or cocaine. I believe the government should not engage in social engineering, but still support a national drug control strategy. I believe the government should not criminalize immoral behavior like getting drunk or fornicating, but want to make an exception for drug use. I believe the government should not ban addictive substances like tobacco and caffeine, but should ban addictive substances like drugs. I believe in the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizures, but not if someone is suspected of having drugs on his person or property. I believe in capitalism, but not when it comes to drugs. I believe in freedom, but not the freedom to try a medical treatment not approved by the government. I believe in the work of faith-based organizations, but not in lieu of arresting people for drug possession. I believe in limiting the scope of government, but not when it comes to the recreational habits of Americans. I believe in the private sector, but still think it is the job of the government to stop drug abuse. I believe the government should eliminate programs that aren't working, but not the war on drugs. I believe in a free society, but not a society where drugs are legal. This is the conservative drug war creed. Again, this is by Lawrence Vance, and I think, obviously he's calling out conservatives here because it's typically conservatives who are advocating for limited government and freedom and personal responsibility and free markets. But this also falls on progressives as well on the left because they also generally support the war on drugs, although they may be more likely to support the legalization of marijuana. They generally want to continue with the war on drugs as it applies to other drugs, but they often support, rather than incarceration something like drug treatment or drug rehab. But these are, I think, incredibly ineffective, especially for people who are there by force. In my experience, people who have successfully gotten drugs out of their life have done so because they wanted to do it. They sought out treatment, they sought out help on their own voluntarily. And I think that court mandated treatment is often ineffective, and people go right back to their old ways once they jump through the bureaucratic hoops that people put in front of them. That's been my experience, and I think that's been the experience of many others as well. So, but nevertheless, I don't think this applies to only conservatives. But I think that the creed here that Lawrence Vance points out highlights the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance of conservatives, and I think apply this thinking also to the typical conservative stance on guns. They'll say, "Oh, you can't outlaw guns because criminals don't follow the law. They'll just have guns anyway." Well, duh. It's the same thing with drugs. The law doesn't stop the crime, doesn't stop the act. People will get what they want anyway. It simply creates more criminals. So I think that there's an incredible amount of cognitive dissonance there when it comes to conservatives, but the Democrats are not innocent when it comes to the failure of the war on drugs either. And frankly, Joe Biden was sort of the architect of the war on drugs when the federal government in particular became more aggressive against drugs in the 80s. And of course, the war on drugs was sort of an outgrowth of the prohibition of alcohol in the early 1900s. It sort of, when prohibition of alcohol was seen as a massive failure, the mechanisms, the machinations of government, the bureaucracy needed to continue, at least as seen by the bureaucracy, and they latched onto these other substances. So there's huge cost. And the other thing I alluded to treatment, people are far more likely to seek out treatment if they're not afraid of going to jail or prison. So they're not going to admit to their relative, to their neighbor, to their church member, fellow church member, that they're using drugs if they're afraid that they might go to prison for it, if they're afraid that they're going to be criminally prosecuted for it. So it creates this society of distrust as well, in an environment where people who genuinely want help are less likely to seek it out. All right, last thing here, I'm going to wrap up. I want to put this into perspective just a little bit. I've got an article here. One is from Prison Policy, and I'll get to that here momentarily, but the other is from the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics, and it's talking about drug overdose death rates. It says over 96,000 people die from drug overdoses a year. Drug overdoses have killed almost 1 million people since 1999, and it has a map, if you're watching this podcast by video, of total annual overdose deaths by state. And you'll see in Indiana it's 1,699. It's incredibly bad in Ohio as well, 4,251 in Ohio. Of course, Ohio has a larger population than Indiana, but it's bad. You see a lot of dark, high numbers in the Midwest here, sort of in the Illinois over to New York section. Relatively high rates of overdose. But the other thing I want to point out here, I mean, look at these historical trends in opioid overdose deaths per 100,000 residents. So this is adjusted for population. Think about how long we've been fighting, the government has been fighting this war on drugs, and look at the results. Massive spending increases, massive militarization of the police, massive increase in SWAT teams and no-knock raids, massive increases in jail population, massive waste of human life, resources, and money. And look at the results. They've spiked. The overdose deaths have gone up significantly since 1999. 6.1 for all drugs, 6.1 overdose deaths per 100,000 residents in 1999. 21.6 overdose deaths per 100,000 in 2019. Now, if that's not a policy that's obviously not only not working, it's not like we're looking at a flat overdose rate here. You would say it's not working if the rates remain flat despite these efforts. Not only is it not working, it's obviously a massive failure. So I think that helps give it some perspective here, and I'll link to this, of course, in the show notes. If you want to go back and look, there's some other interesting statistics here with a lot of breakdown by state to state. Again, that's National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics, Drug Abuse Statistics.org. The last thing here before I wrap up is that there's this Prison Policy Initiative website that keeps tabs on the states of incarceration. And they released this back in June of 2024. They'll update it again next year. But it illustrates and I've put this website up on the screen, it illustrates the rates of incarceration in the United States and in particular states within the United States relative to the rest of the world. And you'll see that most U.S. states are incredibly high. I mean, there are a number there you'll see above Cuba, for instance, and Rwanda. And look at the United States as a whole. 614 is the rate of incarceration. Let's see. What is the number here? Per 100,000 people. 614 per 100,000 people. Do a search here. Russia, 300. So the United States has an incarceration rate more than double that of Russia. Think about that for a moment. Of course, there are demographic issues, societal issues, but in the land of the free, there are more than double the number of people incarcerated per 100,000. That's just insane. And I would submit to you that a large portion of that is as a result of the war on drugs. Whether it's indirectly or directly related, I think a significant portion is a result of the war on drugs. In Indiana, you can see is higher than the United States average by a considerable amount, 721 versus 614. So it's not good. It's a really dim state of affairs with respect to the mass incarceration and the war on drugs. All right, and then the last thing here, just to illustrate the point about how much of this is purely drug related, you'll see in local jails, a significant portion, 114,000 out of 550,000 that are drug related, that are not convicted. So they're incarcerated pre-conviction. and then 24,000 convicted, purely drug related. Okay, so what is that? 138,000 out of 550,000 in local jails are for drug related crimes. Okay, now it breaks down. It's got violent crime, property crime, public order, etc. How many of those are indirectly related to the black market that's created by the war on drugs? Now, that's a harder number to identify, but I would submit that a significant portion of those are also related to drugs and the war on drugs as a result of the black market that's created. And then you can look at, so that's local jails, and then you can look at the numbers for state prisons, and I think that you'd see similar numbers there. So anyway, I'll link to both of those resources as well. All right, so finally, I'm going to finish off with, it's actually the end of an article from fee.org. It's called The Drug War's Assault on Liberty. And the article ends, he says, and I'd encourage you to read this entire article. He says, but the real undoing, and he's talking about how does this all end? Why we can't keep doing this forever, engaging in this huge counterproductive failure. He says, the real undoing of the drug war will be the eventual realization that government cannot alter human nature, and that society is no longer willing to pay the price required in money, social disruption, and reduced liberty to prosecute this war. In the past decade especially, many prominent voices have been raised against prohibition, and no doubt many others will join them in the near future. Moreover, prohibitionists are finding themselves compelled to respond in public to the growing call for legalization to an extent that would have been unheard of 10 years ago. Yet, until the current level of support for prohibition burns itself out, vigilance and the courage to speak out are required if we are to avoid the permanent establishment of new forms of government intrusion into our personal lives. That is the real threat facing us today. So, I hope you got something out of this. Please, if you feel differently, if you think I'm wrong, tell me why. Comment. If you're watching on YouTube or on Spotify, you can comment in the comment section. You can also comment on Facebook or X, where I also post these episodes. I'd like to hear your feedback. Let me know where I go astray. What do I get wrong here? Do you think the war on drugs is worthwhile? It is, setting aside the moral issue, is it worth the cost? And then also, if you want to opine on the moral issue as well, I'm happy to hear any feedback you may have in that regard as well. But I think more people need to hear this, because most people don't realize how much this is costing, not only in terms of money, not only in terms of societal destruction, but also in terms of freedom for people who have no interest in drugs. People like you and me. I just saw a couple of Indiana State police officers the other day out flying their drone so that they could spy on people. And that sort of degradation of privacy, of freedom, and trust. And people wonder why people don't trust law enforcement. It's because of that. And I think that the war on drugs has contributed to that lack of trust to a significant degree. Anyway, thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope you have a happy new year, a wonderful 2025. Thanks again for tuning in. I really appreciate your support. If you like, as always, if you like the episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and share the episode. I'm trying to reach as many people as possible with the ideas of liberty. As always, you can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X. We're on X at Forge of Freedom. You can also find the podcast on all the most popular podcast streaming platforms and at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.